Long before the white dress, before the church aisle, before the exchange of golden bands and whispered vows, there was Rome. And in Rome, a wedding was not a celebration of love. It was an act of statecraft, a transfer of property, a realignment of bloodlines carefully negotiated between families who understood that in the ancient world, a marriage could raise a household to the Senate or destroy it within a generation. For nearly 1,000 years, the Romans built one of the most intricate systems of matrimonial law the world has ever seen, and almost none of it had anything to do with what the bride and groom felt about each other. To understand a Roman wedding, we must first understand what marriage meant in this civilization. And what it meant was something fundamentally different from what we assume today. In Rome, the word for marriage was matrimonium, and its root tells us everything. It derived from mater, mother. All marriage existed, in the Roman legal mind, for one purpose above all others: the production of legitimate children, not companionship, not romantic fulfillment, not even religious devotion, though the gods would be invoked at every stage. The entire institution was engineered around a single question: who are the legal heirs, and to which family do they belong? This was not merely a cultural preference. It was the structural foundation of Roman society. Rome was organized around the genes. The clan and the familia, the household, and the paterfamilias, the eldest living male, held absolute legal authority over every person within it. His wife, his sons, his daughters, his slaves, his grandchildren, all fell under his patria potestas, his paternal power. A marriage did not free a woman from this system. It transferred her from one sphere of male authority to another. The bride left her father's household and entered her husband's. In the earliest and most severe form of Roman marriage, called manus marriage, the woman passed entirely into her husband's legal control. She became, in the eyes of the law, something close to his daughter. Her property became his property. Her inheritance rights shifted to his family line. She could not own, could not litigate, could not act independently in any legal capacity. This was the architecture within which every Roman wedding took place. The flowers, the songs, the torches, all the prayers, all of it rested on a legal scaffold designed to regulate wealth, secure alliances, and produce citizens. The romance, where it existed, was incidental. The contract was everything. And the contract began long before the wedding day. A Roman marriage started with the sponsalia, the formal betrothal. This was not a private moment between two young lovers. It was a negotiation between two patres familias, conducted with the seriousness of a diplomatic treaty. The father of the bride and the father of the groom would meet, often with witnesses, to discuss terms. The central element of this negotiation was the dose, the dowry. The bride's family was expected to provide a sum of money, land, or goods that would accompany her into the marriage. This was not a symbolic gesture. By the late Republic, dowries had become so substantial that they could determine the economic trajectory of entire families. And Cicero's daughter Tullia brought a dowry of roughly 100,000 sesterces, a sum large enough to purchase several houses in Rome. Among the senatorial class, the numbers could be staggering. The dowry of Agrippina, mother of Nero, reportedly included estates, slaves, and liquid assets that rivaled the treasuries of small provinces. The stakes were not abstract. If a marriage failed and ended in divorce, the dowry, or a significant portion of it, had to be returned to the bride's family. This meant that the dowry functioned as both an investment and a form of insurance. It gave the wife's family leverage even after the wedding. It gave the husband a financial incentive to maintain the marriage. And it gave Roman lawyers an endless supply of litigation. Disputes over dowry returns clogged the courts of the late Republic with a regularity that would be familiar to any modern divorce attorney. Once terms were agreed upon, and the betrothal was sealed with a gesture that has survived 23 centuries. The groom placed a ring, typically iron, later gold, on the fourth finger of the bride's left hand. The Romans believed that a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. They called it the vena amoris. It was one of the few moments in the entire process where sentiment was allowed to surface. But even this was formalized. The ring was a public symbol of a legal promise. Breaking an engagement could result in lawsuits, and in some periods the jilted party could claim compensation for financial losses incurred during the betrothal. gifts exchanged, preparations made, opportunities for other alliances foregone. The betrothal could occur years before the actual wedding. Girls were legally eligible for marriage at 12, boys at 14. In practice, among the aristocracy, the betrothals were arranged in childhood, and weddings took place when the girl was in her mid-teens. The groom was often a decade or more older. These were not aberrations. They were the standard operating procedure of a civilization that viewed marriage as an instrument of dynastic planning, not personal choice. And then the day arrived. On the morning of the wedding, the bride awoke in her father's house for the last time as a member of his family. And what followed was a sequence of preparations so precise, so layered with symbolism, that every element carried meaning stretching back centuries, in some cases to rituals older than Rome itself. The bride's hair was divided into 6 locks using the tip of a spear, the hasta caelibares. Some scholars believe this referenced the Sabine women, seized by Roman men in the city's earliest days. Others suggest it invoked the protective power of the war god Mars. Whatever its origin, the spear made one thing clear. This was not a gentle occasion. This was a rite of passage with the gravity of a military campaign. The 6 locks were then woven into an elaborate arrangement called the Seni Crines, held in place with ribbons and crowned with a wreath of flowers and herbs. Marjoram and verbena, plants associated with fertility and the favor of the gods. And over her tunica recta, a straight white tunic woven on an old-fashioned upright loom, the bride fastened a belt tied in a special knot called the nodus Herculaneus, the knot of Hercules. Only her husband would untie it that night. Hercules was the guardian of marriage doors, the symbol of fertility and endurance. The knot was a lock, and the wedding night was the key. But the most distinctive element was the veil, or the flammeum, a deep saffron yellow cloth that covered the bride's head and draped over her shoulders, was so iconic that the Latin word for marriage itself, nubere, literally meant to veil oneself. A Roman woman did not get married, she took the veil. The color was deliberate. Saffron was the color of flame, of Hymen, the marriage god's torch, of the dawn that promised new beginnings. Beneath the flammeum, the bride's face was visible, but transformed. She existed between worlds, and neither daughter nor wife, in a liminal space the Romans treated with profound seriousness. With the bride prepared, the household turned to the ceremony. Roman weddings had no priest in the way we understand the term. There was no single officiant who pronounced the couple married. Instead, the ceremony centered on 2 elements, the reading of the auspices and the joining of hands. An auspex, a religious official trained in reading omens, would examine the entrails of a sacrificed animal, typically a pig or a sheep, to determine whether the gods favored the union. The liver was the organ of primary interest. Its color, its texture, the pattern of its lobes, all were read like a map of divine intention. If the signs were unfavorable, the wedding could be postponed entirely. This was not a formality. Romans took augury with deadly seriousness. Generals delayed battles on bad omens. Consuls resigned office when the auspices proved faulty. In 114 BC, 3 Vestal virgins were condemned to death, partly because their impurity was believed to have corrupted the accuracy of Rome's public augury. A marriage begun under hostile signs was considered cursed from the start. No family of standing would risk it. Assuming the omens were favorable, the ceremony proceeded to its emotional center, the dextrarum iunctio, the joining of right hands. A married woman, the pronuba, who served as a kind of matron of honor, would take the bride's right hand and place it in the groom's right hand. This single gesture was the closest Rome came to what we would call a wedding vow. In some ceremonies, the bride would speak the words that have echoed across millennia in various forms. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. It was a declaration of shared identity, of merged legal existence. The woman was entering her husband's world completely. After the vows, but the marriage contract, the tabulae nuptiales, was signed by witnesses. Typically 10 witnesses were required, underscoring that marriage in Rome was above all a public legal act. The contract specified the dowry, the terms of the union, and the conditions under which it could be dissolved. Marriage was sacred, but the Romans were far too practical to pretend it was eternal. Then the streets took over. As evening fell, the most spectacular phase of a Roman wedding began, the deductio, in the procession that escorted the bride from her father's house to her husband's home. And this was no dignified march. This was controlled chaos. Torchbearers led the way, carrying flames made from whitethorn wood, believed to ward off evil spirits. Flute players and musicians filled the air with sound. The wedding party, family, friends, and often strangers who simply joined the crowd surged through the streets singing the Hymenaeus, the wedding hymn. The refrain, Talasio, it was shouted over and over, though even the Romans themselves had forgotten what it originally meant. Some connected it to the rape of the Sabine women, others attributed it to an ancient hero. The meaning had dissolved into pure ritual sound, a chant that marked the passage from one household to another. The bride carried 3 coins. One she offered to the gods of the crossroads as the procession passed. Another she would give to her husband as a symbol of her dowry. The third she would dedicate to the household gods, the lares, of her new home. 3 coins for 3 thresholds, the divine, the marital, and the domestic. Along the way, the crowd threw walnuts at the couple. Walnuts were associated with fertility and with childhood. The groom's act of scattering them symbolized his departure from boyhood. The noise was deliberate. Roman processions were loud by design. Sound repelled malicious spirits. Silence invited them. And then they reached the door. The threshold of the husband's house was the most symbolically charged space in the entire ceremony. The bride anointed the doorframe with oil and animal fat, offerings that signaled her entry into a new sacred domain. She tied woolen fillies to the doorposts, invoking the domestic arts that would define her role within. And then came the act that has persisted in Western culture for over 2,000 years. The bride was lifted over the threshold. She did not step across it, she was carried. The Romans had several explanations for this. The most common was practical superstition. If the bride stumbled while crossing the threshold, the marriage was doomed. Carrying her eliminated the risk. But deeper explanations circulated. Some said it recalled the Sabine women, carried into Roman homes against their will. Others argued that it demonstrated the husband's strength, his fitness to protect the household. Whatever the reason, that the symbolism was unmistakable. The woman crossed a boundary she could not uncross on her own. She entered the house of her husband, and in doing so, she entered a new legal, social, and spiritual reality. Inside, the groom offered her fire and water, the 2 elements essential for maintaining a household. She lit the hearth of her new home, an act loaded with religious significance. The hearth was sacred to Vesta, goddess of the home and the eternal flame. By lighting it, the bride became the custodian of the household's relationship with the divine. She was no longer a visitor. She was the center of the domus. The feast that followed, the Cena Nuptialis, was lavish, especially among the wealthy. Multiple courses, copious wine, music, poetry, ribald jokes from the guests. The Romans saw no contradiction between the solemnity of the ceremony and the exuberance of the celebration. Marriage was serious, but the wedding night was coming. And Roman culture had no interest in pretending otherwise. The sexual humor was expected, even ritualized. Guests sang the fescenni verses so deliberately crude that the term fescenin became synonymous with obscenity. This was not disrespect. It was believed that crude language, like loud noise, warded off jealous spirits. Eventually, the bride was led to the marriage chamber, the thalamus, by the pronuba. The husband untied the knot of Hercules, and the marriage was consummated. Early the following morning, the bride made her first sacrifice at the household altar, formally assuming her religious duties. She was a wife now. The ritual was complete, but the ritual, magnificent as it was, concealed tensions that would eventually reshape Rome itself. The earliest and most severe form of Roman marriage, confariatio, reserved for patrician families and sealed by a shared cake of spelt bread, was virtually unbreakable. Divorce under this form required a counter-ceremony of equal complexity and was vanishingly rare. But as Rome expanded, as wealth poured in from conquered territories, as the old aristocratic structures bent under the pressure of empire, marriage evolved. By the late Republic, the dominant form had become usus, or coemptio, marriages that could be dissolved with striking ease. A husband could divorce his wife by simply ordering her to leave and return her dowry. A wife, in the later period, could initiate separation herself. No court was required, no judges intervened. Divorce became so common among the Roman elite that the satirist Juvenal mocked women who counted their years not by the consuls, but by their husbands. Augustus himself attempted to intervene. In 18 BC, alarmed by falling birth rates among the aristocracy and a culture of serial marriage, he enacted the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, a sweeping law that penalized unmarried citizens. It rewarded those who produced children and restricted marriages across social classes. Freed women could not marry senators. Citizens who remained childless lost inheritance rights. It was one of the most ambitious pieces of social legislation in Roman history. It was also one of the most resisted. Augustus's own daughter Julia was exiled for violating the moral standards her father had tried to impose. The law revealed a fundamental tension. The Roman state wanted to control marriage. But Roman individuals had discovered that freedom within marriage, including the freedom to end it, was difficult to surrender. By the imperial period, something remarkable had happened. The rigid patriarchal manus marriage had virtually disappeared. Women increasingly married sine manu, without passing into their husband's legal control. A wife retained her connection to her birth family. She could own property independently. She could inherit and bequeath. She could, in practice if not always in social approval, live with a degree of autonomy that would not be matched in Europe again for well over 1,000 years. The Roman wedding ceremony survived largely unchanged, with its saffron veil and its spear-parted hair and its carried threshold. But the legal reality beneath the ritual had transformed utterly. The form persisted, the meaning shifted. This was the paradox of Roman marriage. And it began as one of the most controlled institutions in the ancient world, a mechanism for transferring women, securing bloodlines, and consolidating power. And it ended in the centuries before Christianity reshaped it entirely, as something surprisingly flexible, surprisingly modern in its recognition that marriages could fail, that women had interests separate from their husbands, that the contract mattered more than the ceremony. When Christianity eventually absorbed and transformed the institution, making it a sacrament, making it indissoluble, making it a matter between the couple and God rather than between two families and the state, it was not building from nothing. It was building on a Roman foundation that had already experimented with virtually every model of marriage the West would ever know. Strict patriarchal control, companionate partnership, serial marriage, and easy divorce.